Hello, hello, and welcome to the David Messiah YouTube channel, where our watchwords are to teach and to build back up the kingdom of Zion. And my name is Sidney Thomas. I'm the founder and the moderator of this YouTube channel. The title of the present talk is The Appointed Time. The Appointed Time. And like I always try to do, I define terms. And by the term the appointed time, what I refer to, as was addressed in this book of mine, the appointed time, the tarrying and his faith, or the testament of the suffering servant, which I wrote under my spiritual name, Malachi Yahya Ben Yamin. The idea of the appointed time, or the definition of the appointed time, is that time that is prophesied in Scripture when Babylon order would be brought down and Zion order would be raised up in its place, and along with the restoration of Zion order, the throne of David. That is what I mean by the appointed time. And I want to address that topic for a couple of reasons. The first reason, of course, is its innate interest that we who are the Negro, we who are the sort of the central object of what this is all about, known in Scripture as Armageddon. Because when they talk about the war of Armageddon in Scripture, what they're talking about is the war upon the Negro. Armageddon is just another way, in terms of the original Paleo-Hebrew, of referring to the people of Nega David. Okay, our king, our ancient patriarch, Nega David. Where Nega is a word that means king. And from that word, and it literally means actually, he who is watched over by the Most High. He who is the apple of God's eye, who is beloved of the Most High. That's what that word actually means. And it came to mean king because this is used to refer to our beloved King David. The actual word in the Paleo-Hebrew for king is something more like ras or rash or res or something like that. As if, for example, in Rastafari, which is a word that means head or chief or king or things of that nature. But by ascription, Nega came to mean king, and it's still there in even the European languages. In English, king derives from the word Nega. In German, the word König derives from the word Nega, and that means king. Okay. And Negro, in terms of the Paleo-Hebrew, is a word that means those who are of the same root, tribal root as Nega David. So the word Negro literally refers to the people of Judah, the Bayuda people. That's who we are. That's just another way of referencing the Negro. Well, Armageddon is now an anglicized way of referring to the Paleo-Hebrew word Har Amagededi, where Har, that prefix means the horn of, or the power. The power of what follows is the Amagededi. Ama is another sort of a prefix word that means the whole house or tribe of. Like we just heard about the coronation of the king of the Amazulu. Ama there means the children of, or the house of those people known as the Zulu people. So in Har Ama Gededi, Ama carries that same meaning, that reference to a collective. And the collective referred to there is Gededi. And the Dedi in that suffix is just another way of referencing David, because his name was Deod. and also de and do and da and things of that nature. And get de, that letter ge there, which also occurs in the word nega, is the letter ga in the Paleo Hebrew, depicted by an eye, which is referring to the one that is watched over. So Gededi is saying the watched over David. And Armageddon is saying the people of this watched over David. And that's exactly the same in terms of what it refers to as the Negro, the people of the tribal root of the watched over Nega, King David. So in Nega, the reference to David is sort of implied but not explicit. In Gededi, the reference to David is explicit. So the watched over David, the Amma, the people of the watched over David is just another reference to those of the tribal root of David, which again is Judah, the Bayuda people. And the central sort of dynamic which the world has seen these past 2,625 years since the siege of Jerusalem by the forces of Babylon has been a war against the Armageddon. Okay, and it's culminating now in the bringing down of the forces which have been arrayed against the Negro. And those forces are nothing but the Psalms 83 confederacy of Edom and Ishmael and Moab and Ammon and the people of Hagar, the Hagarenes and the Philistines and Tyrians. In other words, all those nations round about have hated David, the people of David out of envy, and it says so plainly in Scripture. Example at Ezekiel chapter 35, verse 5, where it says Edom, hates Israel with a perpetual hatred because Esau thought that he was stolen, his birthright was taken away from him by Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, Yesharalo. So that has been the fundamental dynamic these past 2,625 years, and especially these last 400 odd years. Because over the last 400 years, the Negro has been fulfilling the prophecy of Genesis chapter 15, verse 13, which said that we would be brought into servitude in a land not ours. And that nation that would have brought us into that servitude, the Most High would judge us in verse 14, Genesis 15 and 14. The Most High would judge, and they afterwards, they meaning the children of the Armageddon, the Negro, would come out of great substance, with great substance. So this is what the forces, the confederacy of Psalms 83, led by Esau, Edom, but also including all the others, Ishmael and Moab and Ammon and so forth, have all been arrayed against the Negro. That is the essential fact of the war. They call it the war of Armageddon, but it's actually the war against Armageddon, against the Armageddon. Okay, but a time was set, and it is implicit there in Genesis chapter 15, verse 14, when that war essentially would come to a head. And in 14, Genesis 15, verse 14, essentially it is saying that judgment would be against the Psalms 83 Confederates. And it is saying that the Armageddon, would come out with great substance. So in other words, it's going to be a victory for the Negro. This is it. This is what is fundamental, and that what is going on in the world. And that is what explains what happened just these past couple of weeks ago, I think it was, with was it the Uhuru Freedom Party and that raid that the FBI launched upon that party, African People's Socialist Party, I think is its formal name, under the leadership of that chairman Yeshi Taylor, which is a very interesting Hebrew name, actually, although he identifies essentially as a Pan-African. But really, Yeshi Taylor is a Negro name. Okay, and I fully identify with what I could see them talking about in terms of the aims and objectives of that party, except for this Pan-African identification, because the issue is not that war is not against Pan-African peoples. It is a war against the Amageteti. That's who they're interested in. All kinds of African people who are included in the Psalms 83 Confederacy. Okay, and we must, as a people, must start to understand that very clearly. And when you start sort of making allies with people who indeed are your enemy, it's not going to work. Okay, and I refer especially to those who ally with those who either themselves allied with Ishmael or themselves of Ishmaelite derivation. And there are many of those in Africa. They identify, of course, as Muslim today, and they were involved in the fight against the Negro long before, in terms of the trans-Sahara slave trade, in terms of the trans-Indian Ocean slave trade, from long before the transatlantic slave trade, and continued after the transatlantic slave trade had been brought to an end. And they are as implacable enemies of the Negro as are those Edomites that we deal with here in the West, in the Americas. And if you've traveled a bit, you only have to go to a place like Somalia or meet a few Somalians to understand, wait a minute now, there's a people amongst the Somalians called the Ivri people, who are the Hebrew people, the Negro within Somalia, and they're heavily discriminated against. It's the same in a place like Yemen. And part of the problem there with Sudan, the war between North Sudan and South Sudan, was essentially that war against the Negro of the Arabs who were there in the northern Sudan. And for me, this is not a personal thing. This is just a historic fact. Because I do well remember having a friend of Muslim persuasion from northern Sudan, and he was the greatest guy. And I remember well meeting also another Sudanese fellow who was descended from the Mahdi that fought against the British. And we met in because we were both, operations research sort of specialists. And you meet people and befriend people in these conferences that we attend and so forth. And we had a great time. So I don't have a problem with anybody on a personal level. I worked at one time with a brigadier general from the Israeli army on a project having to do with technology development in a place in Korea, as a matter of fact. Okay, that dealt with the help raising up of Korea as the industrial power that it later became. The Hyundai factory and etc. And and again at a personal level, he was a great guy to work with. I got on better with him than I got on with the task leader, the mission leader, who was an Egyptian fellow. So none of this is at all personal. But the personal friendships that one can make across these lines has got nothing to do with the march of history. And the war against the rise of the Armageddon people in America, the war against the rise of the Negro in America, was there going back. There's a book that Kurimeo A. Howe at least brought to my attention in one of his YouTube videos that was written by Benjamin Franklin. And it was frankly talking about, you could see the sort of the seminal roots of the white power kind of racism that was developing back then. This is Benjamin Franklin. I think they tried to sort of erase that book from the internet now, because if you try to go look and find it, you're not going to find it anymore. Okay, and then came up in the way of, forget the slave trade. Sorry, not slave trade. Forget that peculiar institution of slavery. Look at what happened not long after emancipation and the coming of the FBI and the COINTELPRO program that was run by J. Edgar Hoover. Because, they're deathly afraid of this Negro Messiah. That's who they're afraid of. Now, they may call him black. And our own people may want to think of him as Pan-African, but he's not. He's a Negro. He's a Negro Messiah that they're afraid of will arise. And he has arisen, as a matter of fact. And they probably thought, well, maybe Yeshua Taylor is one. It could be the one. I don't know. Because all of a sudden, we hadn't heard about COINTELPRO for a long time. We hadn't heard about the FBI doing the kinds of things that they did to bring down people like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and SNCC and the Black Panther Party and so forth. It's as though they'd gone quiet about that. But now all of a sudden they're doing it again. And you have to ask yourself why. Because that is the essential program. Now, the rest of it, in terms of what the United States is doing to try to starve off the rise of China as a sort of a challenger to its hegemony, and to beat back down Russia in terms of Russia's challenge to its hegemony, because what has Putin said very plainly, they will not submit to that hegemony. They will not submit to NATO military assets being brought so close to its border that if NATO happened to have a hypersonic weapon, it would be only a 5-minute hypersonic missile flight from their capital, Moscow. And for them, it is clearly an existential threat for that to be the case, as it was with Kennedy, when Khrushchev sought to, and actually did for a time, put a missile base in Cuba that was only 90 miles away from Miami. And of course, that was not acceptable to the United States. And of course, because it is an existential threat, they had to make the Cubans and the Russians back down. Because for them it was an existential threat. Well, it's the same thing happening now. Having NATO military assets that close to the Russian border has to be seen by them as an existential threat. And the idea being that, look, if we have these forces arrayed against you, because they have military bases ringed around Russia, with the idea that they would bring Russia to heel and continue thereby to claim the sort of hegemon role that they have enjoyed these past many decades, at least since the Second World War. So that has now come to an end. They're going to go down fighting, or rather flailing like a drowning man. But the world is now clearly changed. And it is no longer going to be the unipolar world that America has enjoyed in terms of being that top dog. But what has happened, because we are now at the time of the appointed time, the Most High has taken from them the dominion. That happened in the spiritual already, as I have been led to understand. In the very first video I put up on this YouTube channel, that demand letter upon the Catholic Church and upon the state of Israel, let us to know that the Revelation chapter 18 verse 2, Babylon is fallen, was actually fulfilled, but in the spiritual, already as of March 25th this year. And it is only now a matter of time for it now to be fulfilled also in the physical. But we're seeing all the signs. And those who have eyes to see will see the signs. It's something as prosaic and as simple as Joe Biden basically losing his marbles in office. He's obviously suffering some kind of progressive illness whereby he is losing cogency of mind. He's not anymore compos mentis. His mind is gone. It's not working as it should for one to be a president of the United States. He's not coherent anymore. In one sense, it doesn't matter because the president of the United States for a long time has only been a figurehead in any case. And there are other people behind the throne that basically determine a United States government policy. So to that extent, in a way, it doesn't matter. He's not the one sort of, prosecuting that war. Essentially, it's a war against Russia, using Ukraine as a proxy to do so. It's not even being prosecuted by Lloyd Austin, who is the defense secretary, or by Anthony Blinken, who is the Secretary of State. Those are just the sort of figureheads that, that they put forward with lines to sort of repeat, because it's being orchestrated from behind the scenes by those that are called the movers of that project for a new American century, at one time called the neocons, when they were allied with the Republican presidency, and now some of them, some call them the neoliberals. Well, they're neither conservative nor liberal. They have been um, sort of steadfast and single-minded in what they have been there to do, which has been to assert American hegemony, American power, but where in fact it is not America per se that is wielding the American power. I don't know if that makes sense. American power is merely used by them. It's as though you have a sort of a brain implant and there's somebody else that's working your body and your mind. Because these PNAC people were all of a certain persuasion. Okay. And this is the idea found in the book of Revelation of that mystery Babylon, the whore, that great whore that rides that red dragon with the 7 heads and the 10 horns. So the powers are depicted there by the horns, but somehow there is this other power, the mystery Babylon power, that is riding all these beasts. Elsewhere on the site, on the channel, I have given sort of some greater breakdown as to who exactly is this mystery Babylon, this whore, WHORE. And I have suggested that really that is a homonym for the House of Rothschild, HOR, and the homonym was deliberate. And it is amazing because when the Revelation was first written, in whatever language John the Revelator used, it may have been Greek. The English language had not yet been invented. So it is kind of amazing that the Most High could arrange for a homonym that requires, the coming into being of a language that at the time it was given did not exist. So this is really all what is going on. So we are at the time now that is the appointed time. Appointed time being the time for the downfall of Babylon order, and with it the raising back up of Zion order. And with the raising back up of Zion order, the coming back into being of the throne of David. So this is what this talk is about, and I'm sorry to have taken this long just in defining that particular term. But I want to talk about it in terms of the book, as I've already brought up on the screen, that I earlier wrote on that subject, the appointed time, the tarrying, and his faith. Because in that book, I was called upon to say something about when that would be. Some of this stuff, well, that particular chapter, when I reread some of what I was given to write in this book, some of what was in that particular chapter was written already way back in 2011, 2012. And I want to come here now to the table of contents very quickly. Well, there's a very long preface, so just to come to the table of contents takes some time. Yes, well, here we are. Well, this was so the book was first written in 2017, and then I gave a second edition, and which is this one, which was April in 2018. But here we had chapter 10 was the appointed time, and I want also to make reference to chapter 16, the restoration of Urim and Thummim, because this was a tool that I was given at the time, even to say anything about the appointed time. And what came out of that chapter essentially was, and let me come quick to it. Uh-oh. Yeah, so this was a chapter. Okay, yeah, so here it was. The very first writings on that was as early as August 2011. And I'm getting at this because I have had to change some of what I wrote, and I revisited this subject of the appointed time, because here, for example, in terms of the prophecy of Daniel chapter 12 verse 7, the timeline for it was pointing towards 2014. Okay, 2014. Now, it didn't happen in 2014 because why? There was something called the tarrying, and then there was a Daniel 9:24 timeline, which has us in that range around going to 2021. And then we had testimony of Daniel chapter 8. And here we were going to cleansing 2024. So you see the picture that was emerging. Okay, so my point now is to say I have had to revise much of what I wrote way back then, and I've been made to bring it into this book, my most recent book, which is The Coming of David Messiah, sort of the textbook, if you like, for this channel. And so here now we're looking at 2025 kind of range, and in 2019 and 2025 and 2019, depending upon what particular starting event you're looking at and what particular ending event you're looking at, because the appointed time is not, it is actually a series of events in the end time timetable. So it doesn't happen all at once. So like with this timeline, it's 2019 now. Okay, and what happened in 2019? At March, I was given that March 24th, 2019, which is actually now the first day of the new year, 6005 on the Most High's calendar, was when Revelation chapter 14, verse 1 was fulfilled, but only in the spiritual. And Revelation chapter 14, verse 1 refers to the Lamb standing upon Mount Zion with the 144,000 elect. And I made the mistake then of thinking that that would have been a physical event, only later then to find out that it was never to be a physical event, but rather a spiritual event. And that understanding came um, after having read um, after having read the sealed portion of the Book of Mormon. And that was given there and here it is, the sealed portion, chapter 21, verse 63, where it says, "And the elect shall begin to gather from the four corners of the earth. But this gathering shall not be done in haste, nor shall it be a physical gathering, but it shall be a spiritual gathering that is done in wisdom," blah, blah, blah. So what happened on the date I had been given, Sunday, March 24th, and here is the key here, that is what was started on Sunday, March 24th, 2019. The first day of the new year, year 6005, on the true Enochian calendar. In the spiritual, as just attested to at the sealed portion, chapter 21, verse 63. His first order of business then was to start the process of gathering his 144,000 elect upon Mount Zion. So some of what I want now to talk about is the idea that it is possible, and let me read it here. This is footnote 12 in the preface to the book, The Coming of David Messiah. There was an error. So here, let me read what this footnote says about that. It says there's a philosophical point here about error and prophecy. First, servants of the Most High do not always get it, quote unquote, right. Nevertheless, even when they get it apparently, quote unquote, wrong, it may yet still be right in the larger sense that the error, quote unquote, in question may well have been exactly what the Most High intended, that some other lesson be delivered thereby. Jonah is a case in point. His prophecies at Nineveh were erroneous, since the doom that he prophesied did not come to pass, which, by the way, raises a point, because one can be a true prophet, as was Jonah, because you're a true prophet if and only if you do exactly what the Most High tells you to do after he's called you to do something, sent you to do something, and then you do it. Then that's what defines a true prophet. But nevertheless, in the case of Jonah, his prophecies appeared to be erroneous. So in a sense, his prophecy was false. So make a distinction between a false prophet and a false prophecy. And between a true prophet, he was disappointed. Instead of rejoicing that his prophesying wrought the change in the people that brought them deliverance from the doom that otherwise would have befallen them. The Most High also used the event to punish Jonah for seeking to run the other way when his call came. Right? Now, let me just make a remark here, because this precept is explicitly stated actually in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 18, verse 8, which allows for the Most High in his wisdom to basically, after he is pronounced upon a people, to basically in his mercy to say, well, all right, I'm going to stay the punishment that would otherwise fall. Here it is, Jeremiah chapter 18, verse 8. If that nation against whom I have pronounced turn from their evil, I will repent of the evil that I thought to do unto them. Okay, so he sent Jonah to basically to pronounce upon them, while holding this Jeremiah 18:8 sort of in his back pocket to say, well, let's see how they respond to that. So I was sent to put a demand letter upon the Catholic Church and upon the state of Israel. How they responded, I know the church basically, I wouldn't say they responded to that demand, but it wasn't long after that demand that the Pope was doing this, whatever, prayer for Russia and Ukraine and so forth. Okay. So how that might have changed now what was there in what I was told to deliver unto them, because I was told to deliver unto them that Babylon is fallen was going to take place March 25th. That Revelation chapter 19 verse 18, which was that great big feast of the fowls of the air, who would then feast upon, chief captains and kings and mighty men and so forth, who would be slaughtered in their numbers. That would take place at Passover this year, which was about April 5th. And I had the idea, well, it was going to happen not alone in the spiritual, but also in the physical. But that didn't happen, did it? So but what I am now to gather is, well, all right, because it was something again similar when the children of Israel were brought to that place where they could have gone across. And Moses sent a scouting party of 12 men drawn from every tribe. And when they came back and made their report, it was only two, Joshua and Caleb, who were strong in favor of going ahead, and all the others were weak-kneed and brought sort of fear upon the nation, so to say. And so they were afraid to go over. And so although they could have gone over at that point, trusting in the Most High to give them victory, They said, well, look, we are like grasshoppers in the sight of these giants over there in the land. So it took them another 40 years before that event took place. Okay, so sometimes, and that whole generation had to pass before what could have happened 40 years earlier, in fact, did then happen when they went over and took Jericho to start that process. So I'm saying that to say that sometimes a servant of the Most High, and I will not say a prophet, a servant of the Most High is sent and given some information to give, and it seems as though the information he's given to give is as of a prophecy pertaining to when something will happen. And then that's something, if it doesn't happen, you could say, well, okay, this was a false prophet. No, but most you can say is it was a false prophecy. But a false prophecy that was somehow subject to the larger law, which includes Jeremiah chapter 18 and 8, because the Most High can relent. Okay, so and that's what that's mercy, if you like. The Lord is still a merciful Lord. All right, so now moving on. Second, a servant of the Most High called to prophesy on one thing is not necessarily thereby prophetically guided on anything else he may say, far less in general. So there's no person who is a sort of an all-purpose prophet, meaning to say that everything that comes out of his mouth is as though guided by the Most High. No, that wasn't even the case with Moses. That's why when they would ask Moses a question, what he would generally say is, look, okay, I hear that, and that makes sense. Let me go and check with the Lord, and I'll get back to you with an answer. So but he would rarely talk off the top of his head when he was being asked to pronounce on certain things. And the one time that he did talk off the top of his head, it was a great mistake. This was at the waters of Meribah, where the children of Israel, so vexed him that he spoke out of turn. And indeed, he and Aaron spoke out of turn. Must we bring you water from this rock? So it was something that he himself, in his power, could do or did do. So the Most High rebuked him for that. Okay, so this is a mistake to think that, in a sense, one is a false prophet per se. It is more likely that one is a servant of the Most High, and for whatever reason, some prophetic word that he was given to give and did not come to pass in the way that he thought it would come to pass. That is as much as one could say, really. And I go on here to say, otherwise, David, who was most certainly prophetic in his Psalms, would not have been misled in the matter of Bathsheba and her husband, right? So people do make mistakes, and certainly those who are otherwise prophets. Third, language is a limited instrument, incapable of capturing every twisting contour of the reality it seeks to describe. Thus, the poetic or metaphorical ought not to be taken literally, and that which is intended to be understood in a spiritual sense ought not to be understood in a physical sense, which is what we see precisely with that sort of kickoff date of Sunday, March 24, 2019, when Revelation 14:1 was fulfilled in the spiritual, but we haven't seen it yet in the physical, because there's been no gathering of the 144,000 upon anything physically that one might call Mount Zion, at the head of which stands, Yeshua. That may happen, but the Revelation 14:1 ought to have been construed by me as a metaphorical statement, and I misconstrued it as a physical event. Okay, so when I got the word from Urim that's when it was happening, I thought that would happen in the physical. And that is what I stated in the first book that he had me to write. But I think he wanted me to write it and make that mistake. Anyway, fourth, Urim is an imperfect instrument of inquiry. For all the foregoing reasons and for the additional one that the answers given by Urim will be wrong to the extent the questions contain wrongful assumptions taken for granted and not examined. As the saying goes in the computer world, garbage in, garbage out. If you ask a stupid question, don't expect an answer that actually does make sense. Okay. So therefore, I'm continuing with the footnote, in the instant case, I assumed that at Revelation 14, verse 1, John spoke to a physical event. Yeshua returned, standing upon Mount Zion with 144,000 elect. Since that should have been understood instead in its spiritual significance, not its physical, as I now understand from the seal portion, chapter 21, verse 63, I was indeed misled and misspoke as to the significance of the date I was given and told to publish. Chastened as I was, when the physical event that I anticipated did not come to pass, I felt rather like Jonah. But then I too had sought to run the other way when my call had come, and so like Jonah, also well deserving of the chastening, because when he told me to go back to Trinidad, I tried to sort of negotiate with the Most High because it was going to be difficult for me in terms of pursuing my international consultancy business. So I tried to say, well, let me go to the Bahamas instead, which was close enough to the United States that, when I had to travel, it was only a hop and not even a skip and a jump over to either through Miami or through Atlanta or through New York. And from there, I could go either to the Far East, via San Francisco or LA, because I had clients in the Philippines at the time, or going the other way across the Atlantic, because I had clients. I had a German client, and also I would visit India. India was another client, and so I could more easily go via the Atlantic that way. So whereas if I were in Trinidad, first of all, the flights were not as frequent, and I would have fewer options in that regard. So I thought, okay, well, let me just, can't I just go to the Bahamas instead? That's practically like home. And he indulged me, really. He indulged me. But in the process, he basically took away most of my little, we would say in Trinidad, my kakada, what I'd sort of saved up and so forth, because the burn rate turned out to be a little bit too high in the Bahamas. And then, as it happened, he wouldn't let me take these jobs as they came. You understand? So, but anyway, that's going off on a digression. Fifth, and in any case, the Most High shares his glory with no one. Therefore, that none may boast, he keeps some things hidden from his servants. Nevertheless, significant the date was, but reinterpreted in the spiritual sense, always intended by John. So that is the first sort of kickoff date. First day of the first month, year 6005, on the Most High's calendar. Now, I have come back to the issue of the appointed time in this book, The Coming of David Messiah. So I have a whole chapter on that, in which I basically take what I had written earlier in the book, The Appointed Time, but now I had to make two corrections. This is the table of contents here. two corrections. And by the way, this book is available in PDF format on the channel at various places, including the what you call it, the sort of basic sort of page. All right, so the appointed time revisited, I call it, and I gave a preamble and introduction, but basically I used what I had written before, but with amendations to make those two corrections. The first correction had to do with the tarrying. That's why this that I had a second edition of the appointed time. Let me go back to that. Yes, I guess I can pick it up right here within this chapter. So let me go to the yeah. So in the title it says the tarrying and his faith. So I had to take into account the tarrying. That was the key. That was the first correction. And he had led me in the meantime to understand before I did this second edition. He had led me to write that other book, Yahweh's Enochian Calendar. So he had given me now the calendar as it needed to be amended from what it had been when Enoch first showed us the outlines and the parameters of the keeping of the Hebrew calendar, called that the first Enochian calendar, which had been based on a return cycle of 364 days for the spring equinox. So a year was exactly 364 days. And then what happened was the earth had gone into such sin that the Most High brought about the flood upon the earth. Okay, so after the flood, what the Most High let me to know was that instead of a 364-day return cycle for the spring equinox, he added a day to it, and it became a 365-day return cycle. And that extra day he put into the first quarter. So at the first, with the 364-day calendar, annual calendar, there were four quarters, each of 91 days. 4 by 91 is 364. And each quarter comprised exactly 3 months. The first month of the quarter was always 30 days. Likewise, the second month of the quarter. And then the third month of each quarter was 31 days. That 31st day being a so-called intercalary day, for reasons which I explained in the book of Enoch. Well, with the 365th day now added, that day went to make it a 31-day month for the second month of the first quarter. So the spring quarter became a 92-day quarter, and all the others remained at 91. So that was the first change. And then after Sodom and Gomorrah, he added a 366 day to the return cycle of the spring equinox. But he only added that extra day every fourth year. And in fact, every fourth year, that was a year that was divisible by 4. And the first of those was year 2168. Right? So every 4 divisible years starting in the year 2168 was a 366-day year in terms of the return cycle. So in such years of 366 days, that extra day was added now to the 8th month of the year, which is the second month of the 3rd quarter, which is autumn. So for the autumn quarter, you have again 92 days, but only once every 4 years, right? So on average, we now then had a year, a return cycle of 365 and a quarter days. So anyone who was still trying to apply the original Enochian calendar of 364 days would after some time find that, wait a minute now, they're falling behind in terms of the arrival of the seasons. Because each quarter, it wasn't an arbitrary thing, each quarter was associated with a particular season. So the first quarter was a quarter of spring, second quarter was a quarter of summer, third quarter was a quarter of the fall, and the fourth quarter was a winter quarter. And each quarter was led by a spirit. Each month was led by a spirit. Each week was led by a spirit. Each day was led by a spirit. So in the law, which is there in Jubilees chapter 6, around verses particularly 36 to 37, there's a prohibition against observing the movement of the moon as the basis for determining when the new month starts. This idea of the Rosh Kodesh, the crescent moon, as the basis in observation for knowing when a new month would start is entirely wrong. The Muslims do that. They call it the crescent moon. The so-called Jews call it the Rosh Kodesh. But in neither case should there be any observation of any moon. And that is also there in the book of Acts. Those who are worshippers of Diana were doing that. Okay, and it is the Diana worshippers that basically gave us that Easter holiday. Because also, another name for Diana was Ishtar or Eostre, depending upon whatever dialect they used. Okay, but we're not supposed to be basing the starts of the months on any observation of any moon. Yes, we use the moon for various things, in fact, but not for this purpose. Okay, so that the basics of the annual calendar that goes back to Enoch after making the correction that the Most High guided me in making after having given me Urim and Thummim, because you can't get it, you can't do that without first having been guided as to Urim and Thummim. And it is in this book here, The Appointed Time, that I first talked about the restoration of Urim and Thummim. Yeah, so here it is, chapter 16. Restoration of Urim and Thummim. So this was given, and I got that as early as 2011. I became actually earlier than that, 2009, when I first fell on my knees and confessed and repented and all of that, and pledged to serve the Most High and only the Most High. And this is after I had been a priest of Ifa and a priest of Shango. So he gave me Urim and Thummim from then, 2009. And I talk about it here in this book, The Coming of this book, The Appointed Time, The Tarrying and His Faith. But once I'd been given this ability, it was the basis on which one could restore the true Enochian calendar. Okay, so the appointed time. So I have had, because of the error that was there in the first go round, the appointed time did not take into account the 4-year tarrying that was prophesied by Habakkuk. And so I have had now to, in chapter 8 now of this last book, The Coming of David Messiah, in chapter 8, to revisit that question of the appointed time. So let's go there now. And oh, by the way, here was Gog and Magog, and this is the so-called Suju freeze, and here is evidence, by the way, that the Negro Israelites had been in China from the beginning. You could see the Hebrew writing there in the back. First letter there is Resh. The next letter there is War. Then there's another Resh, and you could see more Hebrew writing. So they basically destroyed this statue or this frieze because no doubt the faces would have showed a kind of a Negro cast to them. And that is essentially part of the war against Armageddon, part of the war against the rise of Negro power in the world. And the Chinese are guilty of that. But anyway, that's an aside. Let me get to the point. Stick to the program here. As distinct, by the way, from the Russians. And by the way, and let me just, as long as I'm doing that sort of aside, here is a contrast. This is a Russian icon, and it's depicting the transfiguration scene. And as you can see, the figure Yeshua there is depicted as a Negro. And he had with him Moses, and he had with him, if I remember, Elijah. And all three are depicted as Negroes, along with those other servants, apostles, whoever, who were there with him to witness the transfiguration. So where the Chinese are getting rid of all this evidence of a Negro past, the Russians are not. Well, actually, during the Soviet time, they burnt a lot of these icons, and they burnt a lot of the Orthodox churches. But enough survived, and among those that survived, rather than, they haven't hidden them away, they put them into these books where they can be seen. So the Russian soul, it does not permit the same kind of erasing of truth and erasing of history as has been the case for all of these other tribes, Edom and Ishmael, Moab and Ammon, and etc. Which helps to make the point I made in a previous upload, that Russia is actually the king of the south in terms of the prophecy of Daniel chapter 11, and again Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39 in particular. All right, so this is now the appointed time revisited. And in the preamble, I say, this chapter appeared originally in volume